Alrighty, here we are again, attempting to define the last days biblically. We're doing that by crawling through the prophets at a snail's pace. I realize that, but it is what it is. We are still in Zechariah. Last lesson, we looked at the concept of God's people in the last day. And today we're going to look at the theme of the nations, because there's about 17 references to the goyim, the nations. Zechariah is just saturated with this theme. In fact, the idea that all nations would be joined to the Lord, or I think as Isaiah puts it, all nations would flow to the mountain of the Lord in the last days, it becomes thematic throughout the prophets. And themes don't just spring out of thin air. They are developed, and they're developed throughout the story by the prophet. So, in other words, the nations are introduced at the beginning of the story. Then the story develops. Then things happen. But you know what? The nations remain in the story, and they play a role and have a part in the story, and they're relevant to the end of the story. So what is introduced in the beginning develops and it morphs, and I think it comes full circle into fulfillment in the last days. So Scripture kind of sets in motion or sets the nations on a path, and whatever was supposed to happen in the last days with all nations in this redemptive story, they would indeed come to pass, really, when all prophetic themes would come into fulfillment and fruition in the last days, and they did. In fact, open up our Bibles to Matthew. You know what? We have arrived at the end of the story. And a lot of people don't realize that. The New Testament really is the end of the story. We've arrived at the final generation of that age before the end that all the prophets spoke of. Okay, so lo and behold, here we are in the first century. We have Jesus talking to his disciples, and he's talking about that very same end. Matthew 24:14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Man, I cannot tell you how this verse really has been just ravished, destroyed, torn from its context, and interpreted in such a way as to actually create like entire doctrines and theologies, that are predicated on this idea that, the gospel has to go out to every single person and tribe in the remotest parts of the planet, before Jesus can return. And I got to be honest, I think this verse right here, really, it's so stinking easy to understand if we just have an ounce of understanding in regard to context. The scene for Matthew 24 is set up at the end of Matthew 23. Imagine that. And it's contextually confined to the rather simple question, really, that the disciples asked him about the events surrounding the destruction of the temple in their generation at the end of the Jewish age they were living in. That's it. That's how stinking simple it really is. And when we understand and when we know what the New Testament writers meant by world and nations, I think the answers really kind of start falling in our lap. Paul, speaking of this very same end here that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24, he's speaking of the very same gospel, the very same Great Commission that Jesus sent his disciples out, that needed to go out to all the nations. Paul says this, Romans 1:8, "First I thank God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken throughout the whole world." Romans 10:18, "But I say, have they not heard? Yes, indeed, their sound has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." Colossians 1:5 and 6, "Because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel." He's talking about the gospel here, which has come to you, as it has also in all the world. Colossians 1:23, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel, there's that gospel again, which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven. This is the first century, folks. Remember, when Jesus told his disciples to go out and make disciples of all nations, right? And then he would be with them till the end of the age. Do you remember that? Well, the end of the age came, and it sounds to me like they completed their mission. The gospel went out to all nations before the end came, just like Jesus said it had to. So how in the world, that's the question, how in the world did the gospel go out to all nations, the whole world, to every creature? How is that possible? Well, when you and I say world, we tend to think planet Earth, right? Right, but that's certainly not what the ancients thought. That's not what Paul was thinking here. In his mind, Paul was concerned with their world. He was concerned with their inhabited world. And very often, that was a covenant world, if you will. But I'll talk more about that. So what about the nations? When I say nations, what do you think? Most people think nations today. They think worldwide, entire planet, every single nation on planet Earth, right? Yeah, right. I mean, it almost seems obvious, but no, not so fast. If we're going to define things according to the Bible, then all nations, just like the world, must be contextually limited to the redemptive narrative itself, what we have right here, okay? All nations can only be all nations in this story, and you might think, okay, yeah, exactly, Ryan. All nations in the story are all nations on planet Earth. No duh. Hello, McFly, right? Is that what you're thinking? Again, not so fast. Unfortunately, I think many, most I would say, consider the Bible kind of a record of human history. It's like a world history book from the very beginning to the very end. You know what? That ain't true. The Bible is a story of redemption. It's a story of covenant. It's a story that was played out through covenants. The Bible is not about world history. The Bible is about redemptive history. And quite frankly, the history of a particular covenant people. The United States is not part of the storyline. Australia was never one of the nations that participated. All nations is limited because it's about the redemptive history of a covenant people that began in Adam, and then it narrows its focus down to primarily one nation, Israel, who was one nation out of many nations. So, the story of Israel and their surrounding nations, okay, that goes back to their collective origins, to the very first character in the story, Adam. So out of Adam come all the nations that are going to be included in this story. And that's really where I think we need to start. So let's start with the beginning in the story in Genesis with Adam. So, when I say all nations is contextually limited to all nations in the story, and the story begins with this Adam character, that means it's contextually limited to all nations in Adam. In Adam. And right here, bam, I hit on a very controversial term, because like most people, I think most people assume that, you know, like world means the planet Earth and nations means all nations on planet Earth. So too, I think most assume that in Adam is a term for all humanity. All humans, they say, past, present, future, were or are or will be in Adam. And I think this assumption that all humans are in Adam flows from the dominant view that this Adam character in Genesis was the very first human ever created. And out of him, you know, came every person and nation on planet Earth. But you guessed it. You know what? That's not the only view. It's not the only view in town. And I'm just going to be honest here. I'm going to show you my hand up front, and I'm going to let you know that I do not believe that. I do not think the Hebrew Scriptures are explaining to us the origins of man. I do not think the creation in Genesis is the creation of the physical universe along with the creation of mankind. I think Genesis is the creation of a covenant man being placed into a covenant world. Heaven and earth coming together in covenant. In my opinion, Adam was not the first man in the world, but rather he was the first covenant man, or he was the first man in his covenant world, if that makes sense. At least the first covenant man recorded, I guess. At least to the Hebrews. In other words, Adam, whether you want to believe Adam was a real life, literal human being, or if you want to believe he was mythical or some figurative character constructed later to represent Israel's beginning or Israel's creation, whatever you want to believe, this Adam, I believe, was basically taken out of the mass of existing humanity, and he was placed into this garden scene, into covenant with God, and that's really the creation of Genesis 1 and 2. That's the original creation being described. And from the beginning scene in the garden, what do we have? We see the entrance of boundaries through a command, and entrance of law, transgression of law. You got the curse, you got the death, and that really lays the foundation for the rest of the story, which is the road to redemption. Now, if you want to believe that Genesis is about the beginning of human history, go for it. It doesn't really bother me. I don't believe that. Either way, that's a whole series all to itself. Either way, we've got Adam in the beginning, and I'm sure that we can agree on that, right? So, let's just follow the storyline if we can. Out of Adam come Cain and Abel and Seth and actually he had other sons and daughters, but and then they in turn have offspring. And before you know it, underneath this, what I like to call, it's an umbrella of Adam. So I see humanity way up here, all of humanity, and then I see Adam right here, and he's kind of plucked out of humanity, and then under this umbrella, beginning with Adam. So you got this covenant umbrella, if you will, of Adam. And then under that, we've got the roots of this family tree in Adam kind of spreading downward and outward. Okay, so you got all sorts of nations that are produced from Adam. Nations coming out of Cain, out of Seth, and so on and so forth. And later on, we see the ancestral lines of Noah, for example, producing many nations. In fact, many familiar nations, they're all familiar nations, like Egypt and Babylon and Assyria and all the ites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and all that good stuff. All those are coming from those lineages, okay? They're all connected. So in Genesis 10, we see the dividing up and the scattering of these nations along with the confounding of languages. So the point is, underneath this umbrella of Adam, all these ancestral lines coming out of Adam, in my opinion, are in Adam. But, they're linked to their very first father up here, the first original creation that began in Genesis, which is Adam. So, and we have to remember throughout this entire thing, kind of the big picture. This story, and a lot of people don't like the fact that I call it a story, but this story from beginning to end is about the first Adam and the last Adam. First, last. Adam, Christ. That's the story, and everything in between. So that's 1 Corinthians 15, Romans 5 talks about the first and last Adam. So you got death, you've got the curse, you've got bondage to law. That entered with Adam, but that would be taken away with the last Adam, that is Christ. So the promise to crush the adversary, that began way back in the garden scene, Genesis 3:15. It all ties back to Adam. And what I'm telling you is that all nations in this biblical story, I believe, are in Adam. As simple and as obvious as that sounds, I think this just gets lost on a lot of us, especially full preterists, and this is what I'm going to kind of explain here. Like I said earlier, this is a really disputed, controversial topic, but it's important because the concept of being in Adam is intrinsically linked to the subject of the nations, and that's kind of why I'm going on about it. See, there are different understandings of what being in Adam means. And so let me just give you 3 quick views here, okay? So I want you to visualize 3 rows. So you got row number 1, row number 2 in the middle, row number 3 over here. So row number 1 is in Adam means all humanity. Again, very common view, all humanity. Row number 2 are all lineages in or under Adam, but not all humanity. Row number 3 is only one lineage or one covenant line under Adam. And again, not all humanity. So all humanity, not all humanity, not all humanity. Okay? Okay, so row number 1, all humanity is in Adam. Adam was the first human being created, so all humans are naturally in Adam, right? Because all humans literally come from Adam. Okay, that's simple. Row number 2, all lineages under Adam. Remember, I got humanity way up here, and then I've got Adam kind of being plucked out, and underneath him, underneath Adam, all lineages under Adam. So in Adam, row number 2, is a covenantal term. Adam is not the first little human, so then all ancestral lines under the Adamic umbrella that I'm talking about are in Adam. So you've got the world of humanity, then out of humanity, Adam's plucked out, and the covenant world of Adam is created. Okay, from there, from that point, all nations within the story tie their lines back to this first covenant man, Adam. Thus, we're in Adam. Whew. Row number 3, okay? Only one covenant line under Adam is in Adam, okay? And this gets a little, so this is more specific. So just like row number 2, Adam is not the first literal human. And like row number 2, in Adam is a covenantal term, but in Adam here is designated for only one specific ancestral line within all the lineages of Adam. So there's only one covenant line under this umbrella that's in Adam, and that is a faithful line, they say, that runs from Adam to Seth to Noah to Shem to Abraham, then to Jacob, and then the 12 tribes, and then you've got down to Christ. You see that line there? So only this particular covenant line was in Adam. So there you go. Row number 1, row number 2, row number 3, if you could possibly remember that. Good luck. Now, I don't really know of anybody but me who really goes with row number 2, and maybe that should worry me, but that's the way I see it. I think it is the most consistent. So follow my logic here. Maybe let me try to explain this. We see both law and covenant entering in with Adam, and the Mosaic law was later given to one line within the covenant. Okay? Paul says in Galatians 3 that the law was added. Well, what was it added to? Well, it was added to an existing covenant and the existing promises that feed on back, to Abraham and then to Noah and to Adam. Okay, well, why was it added? It was added because of transgressions. What transgressions? Transgressions that already existed under an already existing covenant. And with whom did the transgression begin with? It began with Adam because Adam was in covenant under law. Paul said, where there is no law, there is no transgression. Romans 4. Adam couldn't transgress a law unless there was a law to transgress. That makes sense to me. There are other verses that we could cover, and people don't like it when I use these. They say, well, you're just proof texting them, and that doesn't really mean what it means or what it says. So Isaiah 43:27, your first father sinned, and your mediators have transgressed against me. This is Adam. He was Israel's first father. Your first father sinned. Hosea 6:7, but like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. Now, this really is the story of the Bible. It's about the transgression, okay? The transgression that began in Adam, and you know what? It became this ongoing transgression of a collective covenant people. And then, you know what happened? The Mosaic law was added to it so that the transgression might increase. That's interesting. Romans 5:20. The law was added so that this transgression that started way back in Adam, it was going to increase. Well, why did God want to increase this transgression? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, Daniel, right? To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. Boom, right there. Redemptive history was planning to finish the transgression. The goal of this saga is redemption, to finally and fully deal with sin and the transgression, the ongoing transgression of a people under law. God needed to take that law away, is what he needed to do, and he did. So God gave them the Mosaic law and said, look, okay, people, let's speed this thing up here. Let's get this story going here. Let's snowball this thing so we can get to the last days and let Messiah do his thing. Okay, that's kind of a rough paraphrase, but you get the picture. So all that to say, Adam was in covenant. Thus, Cain, Abel, Seth were in covenant, at least to begin with. And why wouldn't they be? Because this, my friends, is how covenants actually worked. They would have been born into it. You know, it's funny, we make a big deal about this when we compare the covenant of Moses and with the covenant of Messiah. And we say all the time, well, people entered the covenant of Moses through birth, right? And then people entered the covenant of Messiah through faith, right? That's a true statement. See, but the Mosaic covenant was connected to, it was an extension of, and it was added to an already existing covenant that began with and in Adam. Okay? So those in Moses were also in Adam, just like all those other lineages in Adam. But not all lineages in Adam were given the law of Moses. That was reserved for Jacob's line alone. Okay, you really need to visualize that Adamic umbrella with all these various nations and ancestries coming out, and you got this one special line that would be given the law, the Mosaic law, and would be, and through them Messiah would come, who would reverse or cure or remedy the original curse of the law that began way up here with Adam. Okay, so again, if the first covenant originated in Adam, how would his children enter that covenant? Well, birth, just like Moses. There's no scriptural reason to suggest Cain and Abel and Seth would not be born into and under that original covenant of their father Adam. Okay, there's just, there's no reason to believe that. So, those who hold to that number 3 view, that in Adam means only one particular covenant line, from Adam, Seth, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Christ, was in Adam, I think they're neglecting really how covenants worked. But let me be clear on this. Yes, there is an emphasis, I think, on that particular covenant line that would lead to Moses and Messiah and, that would produce Israel. Yes, there's an emphasis on that, okay? That's not in dispute. It's pretty obvious, I think, Scripture records and emphasizes really a select number of lineages. But there's no scriptural reason to exclude the other lines or all lines from the original covenant umbrella of Adam. They were in Adam. I think some suggest that only this one specific line within Adam was, quote, chosen because it was a faithful line. They say it's the covenant line of faith. Well, does that mean that every individual within that Adam, Seth, Noah, Abraham line were of faith? Every single individual? Well, no, of course not. I think that's silly. And I think it's equally absurd to suggest that every individual, in Cain's lineage or Esau's lineage, that they didn't have faith because their father, Cain or Esau or whoever, didn't have faith. Okay, that doesn't make sense. So here's the point, and this is so important. And so many people get confused on this, and we talked about this last lesson. This was the main point of the last lesson, God's people. We need to be careful not to conflate or confuse two separate but very related ideas here. You got God's chosen people, individual people of faith, and you've got God's chosen people, the collective body of covenant people. So you got God's people, God's chosen individuals of faith. You got God's chosen, the collective body of people. Okay, they're two separate things, but they're very related. Okay, there was always people of faith within the covenant and people not of faith. I mean, it's pretty obvious. And Paul, you know what? Paul addresses these two types of peoples, or these two peoples in Romans, when he says, "For they are not all Israel, which are of Israel." That's Romans 9. So during that transition period, in the New Testament, all in Moses were in Adam, okay? But not all of those who were in Moses would be or were in Christ. Look, here's what I'm saying. We cannot use faith as the qualifier for in Adam status, just as we can't use faith as a qualifier for in Moses status, okay? There were plenty of faithless people in Moses, but they were still in Adam and in covenant. You see that? I think that's pretty logical. I think that's pretty clear. But we can and we do use faith as the qualifier for in Christ status, right? In Christ, because entering the new covenant was different. That was entered through faith. The covenant of Adam, later on you got Abraham and then Moses. Those really were family affairs. Those were entered primarily through birth, one's ancestral line. And yeah, there were some exceptions we could squabble over, but that's the point I think many overlook. They say Cain was not an Adam, or at least he stopped being an Adam, and same with Esau. And I disagree. Sure, Cain was not faithful. He was of the wicked one, I think it says. But he was still covenantally connected by birth to and in Adam. Same goes for Esau. Follow that family tree all the way up to Adam. Esau may not have had faith, but he was still in that line of Jacob, was he not? His father, and by virtue of that, he was in Adam. Again, taking this one specific covenant line of Seth and ascribing faith to the entire line and saying only those in this one little line were in covenant or in Adam. Again, that's ignoring how covenant themselves operated. Okay, moving on. So Cain killed Abel, and Cain was driven out, okay? He was cut off from the land, Genesis chapter 4. So the covenant line, or the covenant blessings, I guess, they kind of continued on through Seth. Okay, well, that's fine. So Cain experienced the curse of the covenant. Seth remained, and he kind of experienced more the covenant blessings. You got the curse of the covenant, you got the blessings of the covenant. So Seth really carried that covenant forward. Cain was kind of on the outside looking in, but you know what? He was still in Adam. And this, my friends, and this is important. This is exactly what we see later on, to the northern kingdom Israel, right? The house of Israel and her sister Judah. It's like you got two brothers there almost, or two sisters, whatever. So later on, when the Mosaic law was added, remember Galatians 3, They were warned in Deuteronomy 28 through 32. You either obey and you experience blessings under the covenant, life in the land and so on and so forth, or you disobey and you experience the curses, death, being cut off from the land. Well, you know what? The house of Israel was disobedient and they experienced the curse. And like Cain, they were cut off from the land, driven out from the covenant blessings. In fact, according to Jeremiah 8, God gave them a certificate of divorce. He said, look, I'm done with you. So who carried on the covenant from that point going forward? Well, Judah, the house of Judah. Now, do you see the similarities there? I mean, to me, it's just glaring us in the face. And by the way, if being in Adam means only being part of one special faithful covenant line, then by this definition, the unfaithful northern kingdom, well, the dispersed Israelites, they would have ceased to be in Adam when they were judged. And that doesn't really make sense to me. So, but that's what I think some try to do with guys like Cain and Esau, who were originally in that one special line, if you will, covenant line. They have to say that they went from in Adam to not in Adam, right? And I just don't think so. They were all under the Adamic umbrella and in Adam, and I think these stories of like the older brothers being driven out, I think they're typological sub-stories, I guess, of the larger picture, so that when we see Israel later, being cut off, we've seen this picture before, right? And it's familiar with us, and we know what's going on. So much later on, near the end of the story, in the last days, when we see these cut off descendants of Israel, the elect of faith being gathered back to God, and we see a lot of that in the New Testament. Well, I believe it's consistent to say that the same opportunity was available to those of faith from the cut-off descendants of all who were in Adam. Cain, Ham, Japheth, the other lines of Seth, Esau, whoever. No, why? Well, because they too, like Israel, were in Adam and attached to the original covenant in Adam. And that's my point. All nations out of Adam were connected to the original covenant, but they were cut off in the same way that Israel, who was really just one nation out of many, were cut off and connected to the original covenant of Adam. So this is consistent in my not so humble opinion. It always goes back to Adam. Always. Romans 5, verse 12. Just as through one man, that's Adam, sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men. Why? Because all sinned. The world that sin entered was Adam's world, Adam's covenant world. Being a mortal sinner that he was, he naturally brought sin with him into that world. Well, you know what? Give him some law and bam, you've got transgression, sin imputed. And from that point, many nations came into that covenant world and all sinned against that covenant. So, some have used Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5 to demonstrate that redemption was only, and I mean only, for those under the Mosaic law, meaning Israel, specifically in only the 12 tribes of Jacob. Well, what does it say? It says Galatians 4 and 5. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. You can throw in there Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Okay, so what do we have here? You've got curse, you've got law, you've got redemption, you've got the adoption. Okay, now obviously Jews were under the Mosaic law. There's no disputing that. Okay, but let's be consistent with this. Was Adam under law, and did he experience the curse of the law? Did Adam experience the promised death through law. Did he lose his status as a son of God, which he was, according to Luke chapter 3? And did he need the adoption to be redeemed as a son of God again? So if the answer is yes, you know what? Galatians chapter 4 goes all the way back to Genesis, and it applies to Adam and to all in Adam, all faithful descendants of Adam. So in my opinion, my not so humble opinion, if the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service, and the promises pertain to Israel, and that's Romans chapter 9, if it pertained to Israel, one line out of many in Adam, then they also belong to all lines in Adam, since that's where the entrance of law, the covenants, and the promises began in the garden in Genesis. Not just beginning with Israel only, not just beginning with Abraham only, beginning with Adam. That's where law and knowledge of sin and transgression, imputation of sins, and death entered in, and that's where the promise to remove the curse of the law began, Genesis 3:15. The curse, the death, it spread to all men under and in Adam. But you see, that's exactly where we see the promise and the hope for immortality in life in God's kingdom. So the remedy to humanity's condition, I think, is played out through Adam's covenant, through his covenant world, so that you and I can see it. So we can read this and we can learn how all those nations in Adam and under that covenant umbrella in Adam could become sons of God, could become his people again, and could ascend into his heavenly kingdom. And I think that's the story of the Bible. That is the story of God's people and the nations. And application for you and me today, you might ask. Well, yeah, I think there's plenty of application, but that's kind of for another time. I'm just trying to prove a point here about the nations. So, you know what? I have got so much more to say, but man, I got to stop. I just rambled on and on and on. So, believe it or not, we're actually talking about Zechariah here. Man, I go on so many little rabbit trails. We're actually talking about Zechariah and the nations. But, you know, sometimes I feel like I kind of have to go on these little, what feels like a rabbit trail, so I can lay the foundation for what I really want to show you in Zechariah. So, man, at this rate, we'll get to the New Testament here in about 2 years. Sorry about that. Anyway, that's it for now. We're going to have to talk more about Zechariah and the nations next round. So thanks for sticking with me on this. If you did, that's a lot to absorb. So we will see you next round. Take care and adios.